So welcome. My name is Chaumtoli Huq. I'm the editor and attorney at Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is an innovative social media platform where we bring together activists, academics, and lawyers to talk about issues of law and social justice. You can read articles by those same activists and lawyers and academics on lawatthemargins.com, and encourage each of you to read those pieces. In addition, I would like to, I'm very thankful today that we have with us a guest speaker, scholar activist, Professor Nadasen, who will speak to us on her recently published book, Household Workers Unite, the story of untold story of African American women who built a movement. I just completed reading the book, and so I encourage each of you all to get it. Just for the record, I am not paid by her publisher to promote it. I think it's a topical story at the time around labor rights, and also at the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement, and generally sort of a resurgence around racial justice. So I want to welcome Professor Nadasen today, and I wanted to start with a conversation that's actually the end of your book, which is your epilogue, where you share with us why you came to write this book and your connection to the domestic worker movement, which you have been involved in not just as a scholar, but as an activist yourself. So maybe if you can let the listeners know what is your sort of link and personal story to this movement.
First of all, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all the listeners and viewers out there who are joining us today. I have always been an activist. I was an activist when I was an undergraduate in college. I was involved in the anti-apartheid and anti-racist movement. So that question of activism and social justice have really been central to my life throughout my undergraduate career, my graduate career, and as a professional historian. I live in New York City, and I observed in around 2005 a very vibrant domestic worker rights movement here in New York City. And I was really impressed with the kind of organizing they were doing for multiple reasons. One is these were largely middle-aged women who were of different ethnic, racial, and linguistic backgrounds who were organizing a population that was largely considered vulnerable and unorganizable and powerless. Everything I read in the newspaper suggested to me that domestic workers needed the help and assistance of other people, that they were unable to take care of themselves, that they were incredibly exploited. And so I was impressed with the ways in which this movement could develop strategies for organizing and bring this very diverse group of women together into an incredibly powerful social movement.
And your own story, personal story of being connected to domestic work, maybe you can share a little bit about that, and you mentioned that in your epilogue.
Sure. I'm originally from South Africa. I was born in South Africa of Indian descent, and my great-grandparents were brought to South Africa as indentured servants at the end of the 19th century. And my grandmother and my mother both worked as domestic workers. My grandmother worked full-time throughout most of her life as a household worker, and my mother worked for a short period of time washing clothes for white families when she lived in South Africa. This was a history that taught me about the respect in this occupation, about the ways in which there was dignity in this work. My mother worked in working-class jobs her entire life, and always had respect for work that people did if in fact they cared about the work that they did. So I think I drew something from her experience that really shaped how this book turned out.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things I want to take a pause is those who are listening to use the Q&A feature on the left-hand corner of the screen to ask questions. This really is intended for each of you. And also you can tweet questions with the hashtag #LawAtMargins. So one of the reasons why I started with the epilogue is because you talk about individuals like Bolden and Roberts as working class African American women who were sort of foremothers, if you will, of the domestic worker movement, and their class position as being distinct from those in the civil rights movement. And so being from the sort of working class background seem to have a different perspective on their strategies and also understanding kind of the issues of domestic workers. So can you share some of the stories, but also connect how might their own lives as domestic workers involved in the civil rights movement, how is it different? How are their perspectives different? Does it add something different in terms of how we talk about the movement?
I think the role of domestic workers in the civil rights movement both helps us rethink our understanding of the civil rights movement and helps us rethink our understanding of this occupation and labor organizing. And I'll start first by talking about Georgia Gilmore, who was one of the women who organized in Montgomery, Alabama during the Montgomery bus boycott. And Georgia Gilmore started an organization in her community that she called the Club from Nowhere. And this was an organization of maids and cooks and housekeepers who prepared food. They baked pies and cakes. They made chicken dinners. And they sold this food to people in the neighborhood as a way to raise money to support the boycott. Gilmore was eventually fired from her job, and she opened up a kitchen in her own home and sold food out of the kitchen. And her home eventually became a meeting place for Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders in Montgomery. And so I think her example illustrates for us the ways in which working class women, especially domestic workers, were really the foundation of movements like the Montgomery bus boycott, and how without them the movement would not have succeeded. But in addition to people like Georgia Gilmore, there are women like Dorothy Bolden in Atlanta who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement and supportive of civil rights activity. Bolden had worked to desegregate schools. She had worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But in addition to that, she decided to form specifically a domestic worker rights organization in Atlanta. And through that organization, she sought to transform the lives of African American domestic workers by demanding, for example, a minimum daily wage of $15 a day and car fare. So her strategic effort to pull together domestic workers also reframes the civil rights movement as a movement from one that was primarily centered on the legal struggle to end Jim Crow segregation to one that fought for economic justice for working class African American women.
No, I think the story about Georgia Gilmore is so inspiring because oftentimes when we think about strategies, we look for sort of quote-unquote political types of tactics and strategies, but the fact that she created this movement space and also the fundraising and also, there are instances of stories where you talk about sort of even raising money collectively amongst domestic workers whose wages are to begin with sort of low, are strategies that are lifted up in your book, and so I actually want to highlight that. So in terms of, I just want to shift a little bit now. I think the book does an excellent job, and I don't in this chat want to give it away, and I want people to read it, of the narratives around organizing. One of the things that struck me is some of the strategies, like, for example, standard contract or a minimum wage or certain economic demands, are things that I've heard in the more sort of contemporary domestic worker movement, if you will, and it almost at points felt like deja vu. And it's someone who's been familiar with it. How do we tie in what you write about and the movement, say, in the last 15 years that has now gained a certain institutional foothold, if you will, through the National Domestic Workers Alliance and other groups?
In fact, there are a lot of parallels, and that's one of the things that drew me to write this history is because of my inspiration, as I said, from the contemporary movement, and then wanting to look at the precedents and the antecedents for domestic worker organizing in an earlier period. And we certainly do see a lot of similarity in the language, wanting to fight for employment standards, advocating labor rights, pushing for minimum wage protections, pushing for a standard contract that would clearly define the expectations of the employment, the kinds of breaks that workers would get, the kinds of living conditions that they were entitled to if they were live-in workers. So I see a lot of parallels in the earlier movement and the contemporary movement. One distinction I see, however, which I think is an interesting one, is the language of care.
Mm.
In the current moment, I hear a lot among domestic worker organizers conversations about care and domestic work as care work. And it is care work in many ways. A lot of what domestic workers do is they care for people. They care for those who are unable to care for themselves, whether they are disabled or whether they are children or whether they are elderly. They care for people's homes. The women who I wrote about in the 1960s and 70s, very interestingly, didn't use that language of care. They loved their work. They talked about how much they loved their work. They talked about how important their work was, but they didn't talk about it in terms of care work. And I think that's interesting because as they said, they loved their work, but they were not care workers. They were simply workers, and they wanted to be treated as workers. So their approach was one of advocating for labor rights, not thinking of themselves as care workers. And in some ways, I think the language of care is one that appeals to employers, right? Mm-hmm. Because as employers, people want to believe and want to know that that the people they're hiring are in fact caring for them and have an emotional connection, an emotional bond to their families and their homes. Whereas in the 60s and the 70s, I think these workers were very clear that they were not one of the family, that they were not simply there because they cared about these employers, but they were in fact, they wanted to be treated as employees with labor rights.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought that distinction. I wonder whether some of the casting of the demands as workers' rights is because of the stereotype of black women in U.S. history, you know, the sort of mammy, the caregiver, whose labor under this care rhetoric is the way that free labor was exacted, right? It was taken from black women. And again, at the expense of being generalized, that maybe more of the recent advocacy by, you know, predominantly immigrant women maybe doesn't sort of tap into that history, whether that plays a role in this, or is it the time, the current political context? I wonder if you can speak to that, because I do want to tease out a little bit of organizing, the differences amongst black women organizing around domestic work, and then sort of immigrant women as well. So.
Yes, I think it's both of those things. So the women who the African American women who organized in the 60s and the 70s really were organizing against a backdrop of the mammy stereotype, which had dominated the occupation of domestic work for African American women since the 1920s. And the mammy stereotype was one which cast African American women as loyal servants to white families who were completely devoted, who had no interest or family or care of her own, but was in fact there only to serve the white family. So the mammy figure played an important role in popular culture, and I think shaped the occupation and justified for white Americans why African American women were domestic workers. It justified an unequal racial hierarchy. So I think when these women organized in the 60s and the 70s, it was very much to counter that stereotype of the mammy figure, to say we are not one of the family, we are not here because we simply care about you, we are workers and we need to be treated as workers. At the same time, the 1960s and the 1970s was a moment when the labor movement was still fairly strong, right? We had a pretty vibrant labor movement, and to be included and to be a part of that larger labor movement by claiming oneself as a worker with rights, I think was part of their strategic vision of sort of expanding the boundaries of how labor was understood, expanding the boundaries of how the labor movement was understood. And today, I mean, immigrant workers are organizing in a very different historical moment when the labor movement is seen to be much weaker. And again, they are not coming from that same background of the history of racism and the culture of servitude that shaped the occupation here.
I see. And so as a result, the kind of care language is perhaps to appeal to employers because of a weakened labor movement. Is that a fair sort of conclusion? I'm just trying to understand how to place this sort of, because I think you're absolutely right. I'm definitely seeing this care giving as sort of a language that's emerging in the domestic worker and also home health care field as well, and just trying to place it in the context of your book.
Yes, I think part of it is also what might be strategically the most effective at this particular moment in time. And under neoliberalism, when workers of all class backgrounds have fewer and fewer rights, even middle-class workers have fewer labor rights. I think to make an argument for labor rights might just be less effective for domestic workers than making an argument based on care, which everybody understands or seems to understand. There is a social value to caring for people who are disabled or who are unable to care for themselves. So I think, in that sense, the historical moment does become very important in terms of the kinds of arguments that labor organizers are able to make.
Great. So at this point, I want to encourage folks, if you do have questions for Professor Nadasen, to either tweet them or to use the Q&A function on the Google chat. So I want to talk about, you talk about in the book that due to changing demographics, in terms of immigration, that some of the organizations for domestic workers were not sort of sustainable or did not continue to the present. And I just wanted to talk about why do you think that's so, and that also that many of black women entered into other fields of work, and so so some of the organizing organizations sort of ended. But as a result, I feel like that history, which you now recover in your book, sort of got lost. And how might we learn from sort of this example of sustaining working class movements led by working class women, and to maintain sort of the organizations and to the present? Like, how do we sustain those organizations so they don't sort of become historical?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very hard to sustain working class organizations. I think there are always questions of funding, which is limited. There are questions of the time that people are able to devote to organizing. There are ways in which people's lives change and they can't devote the same amount of time. So I think it's difficult to sustain working class organizations. And in the 1970s, it was especially hard because of the rising conservatism that began to dominate the 1970s, as well as the economic crisis, the stagflation, the high unemployment, and inflation simultaneously that made it harder for all working class families to survive financially. So I think, though, that larger context, as well as just a decline of organizing more generally, of social movement organizing, made it difficult for the household technicians to sustain their organization. But what I would like to think about is the ways in which there is a continuity of movement organizing, even if organizations come and go. And so I almost think it's inevitable that organizations will come and go. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think organizations emerge at a moment in time and they represent that moment in time. But I think their legacy continues in one way or another. The household technicians was essentially dead by 1980. But in the 1980s, we see social movement union or emerging. And so we see, for example, hotel keepers that are beginning to organize. We see justice for janitors. And to me, that's a kind of a legacy of this organizing. Whether or not there was a direct connection, I'm not totally sure, but there were people who certainly observed household workers in the 70s who then were involved in the movement in the 1980s, and I would love for somebody to write about what those connections are. So I think of a sort of continuity of social movement organizing that actually dates back much longer. We could go back to the 1930s and look at the influence of the 1930s on what happened in the 1950s and 60s. And I see the contemporary movement as kind of building upon that earlier legacy, even if it has not always done so in a very overt, conscious way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I agree with you on that in terms of you can see the linkages, but oftentimes those linkages aren't made explicit, and I think what your book does really well is to make that an explicit historical link. So I want to shift towards talking about sort of history as an activist work as well, because I think that that's a very dominant theme in your book, and also that because these links are not made, certain stories get erased. So in the domestic worker movement, the stories of black women do get erased because there isn't that institutional presence. And so I think what your book does, I think, is to make those linkages explicit in the absence of the organization. But because continually women of color's histories oftentimes are the ones that get lost in this failure to sustain the organization. So on history, can you share with us, what are your views of history, and why should activists care about history? And we don't have time. We're on the ground. We're always doing movement emergency work. We don't have time to read a book or delve into archival materials. Why should it matter? Why does it matter?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would start off by saying, as a professional historian, I think history is not something that is only produced by professional historians. I think we are all history makers. I think we are all history tellers. We are certainly all storytellers. And I think that how we craft our history is something that shapes our day-to-day lives, whether we are aware of it or not. We all come from a particular history, and that history has shaped us, has shaped who we are. It's probably determined where we are right now. And I think it's a question of kind of making that explicit and being aware of that is so important. These women that I write about in the 60s and 70s did in fact become very aware of the importance of their own history in influencing their movement and how their movement unfolded. So they talked about, for example, the history of the Bronx slave markets.
Right.
And Geraldine Miller was an organizer, domestic worker organizer in New York City. She had never experienced the Bronx slave market. And these were street corners that had emerged in the midst of the Great Depression in the 1930s, where African American women stood to be hired for the day by white employers. And Geraldine Miller had heard the stories of the Bronx slave market, and she told these stories as she was organizing. And she told other women that employers would drive by and look for the women with the most scarred knees. Mm. And she said, and they looked for the women with the most scarred knees because those were the women who would wash floors down on their hands and knees. And Miller told a story in order to mobilize other women, but to also help them develop standards for the occupation. And what she said is, we are no longer going to scrub floors down on all fours. And so the telling of the history and her rendition of that history becomes a way to develop a vision for the future, a way to think about how things can and should be different. And so that, for me, is one potent example of how the telling of our own history, which is not a history only of vulnerability, but also a history of empowerment, a history of resistance, is one that we as activists can use and should be using as we think about organizing.
Thank you for bringing up that example. I think the Bronx slave markets is sort of a very concrete way of using history storytelling as a mobilizing tool, because oftentimes history is seen as something we should know, but it's not linked to actual sort of strategies that organizers use. Um, I want to get a little bit into, in our remaining time, to focus a little bit more about storytelling as a political mobilizing tool. How do you see it being used today, whether it's in the domestic worker movement or other worker movements? Maybe some other examples you can share in which how activists can effectively use storytelling and history in their organizing work.
I think the way I saw this used most effectively is when I talked to contemporary domestic worker organizers. So there's a woman who worked here in New York City with Domestic Workers United. Her name is Erlene Brown. And she went to a meeting in Amsterdam and met other domestic worker organizers from around the world. And when Erlene came back and she told me about her experiences in Amsterdam, she told me, I heard stories from women in Bangladesh, and I heard stories from women in China, and I heard stories from women in the Gulf States. And what they told me about their experiences as domestic workers was actually very similar to what I experienced as a domestic worker. I went to a Domestic Workers United meeting, and I heard there a woman from Mexico City who had been organizing domestic workers, and she told her story about what she had experienced. And I think what these stories do is they enable domestic workers to transcend perhaps their specific geographical location, transcend the particular language they speak or the culture they come from, or the country that they live in, and to make connections with other women who are similarly exploited. And that is incredibly powerful, and it's a way that this movement has been able to develop solidarity across lines of race, across lines of ethnicity, across lines of culture and citizenship status. And to me, that is the most exciting thing about what I see happening with domestic worker organizing today.
And some of the cross-racial organizing actually happened also before, and you talk about that when there were certain xenophobia that the many women said no, they're domestic workers too. They share our experiences, and we're very much open to immigrant women. And I think that that even knowing that history, because there's a myth, right, that immigrants and African Americans are at odds in terms of economic justice issues, and I feel like your book does a great job to counter that myth. Are there other myths that that sort of writing this book and researching it that need to sort of be told in our current organizing? Like, are there certain myths that we're operating under that might need to be sort of broken?
I mean, I think the dominant myth about this occupation, and I think the current movement has already dispelled this, is that domestic workers are unorganizable. And I think there are assumptions that the labor movement has operated under, that domestic workers are dispersed, isolated, atomized workers, working in the privacy of the home. They sometimes enjoy their work, or perhaps they're doing this work out of choice, and that they are in fact not workers, and it's extremely difficult to organize them. But I think what the movement of the 1960s and 70s shows us, and what the organizing today shows us, is that it is in fact possible to organize household workers. And they've been organizing even in earlier periods. In the 19th century, there were washerwomen in Atlanta that organized, and the historian Tara Hunter has written about this. So I think there's a very long tradition in history of organizing among domestic workers, and that's an important myth that has been dispelled.
Great. So I want to slowly wrap up, and I want to encourage folks to ask Professor Nadasen questions. Again, the two ways you can ask questions is you can tweet at Law at the Margins, use the hashtag Law at the Margins, and then also you can use the Q&A feature that's on the Google chat so that we can pose those questions to the professor. There's also a Facebook page, and there are 2 great articles written by the professor on her book. So I will encourage folks to look at those and read those, and I will continue to post additional materials on this topic. And that page will be live after this chat, so it can be serve as a resource for folks who are interested in following this topic. So the area that I want to sort of close in, and Law at the Margins, sort of motto is to inquire, investigate, and then involve. So involve is a big piece of the work that we try to do, is sharing the information, but then how to get people involved. So the 2 areas that I think that people oftentimes talk about is the difficulty in reading, history, scholarship. We don't have time. How could activists engage with historians or other academics to engage in some of the scholarship to then bring into their own work? And how would you want activists to engage with your book?
I think there's a lot of work to be done to bridge the divide between scholarship and activism. And, some of that rests with activists who are, in fact, very busy and don't have time to do a lot of reading. And some of that rests with scholars who very often don't write in an accessible way and certainly don't have activists as their audience when they are writing. And so I think that's a long-term struggle. The National Domestic Workers Alliance, I know, has worked to try to build more and more bridges with scholars and has asked specifically for scholars to write specific position papers or to circulate letters of support or to write op-eds to the newspapers around issues that seem to be pertinent at any given moment. So I think there are ways that scholars can think about how to connect with activists, and especially domestic worker activists. It is a question of perhaps changing the way we write and trying to make our work more accessible. I also think it is incumbent for activists to begin to think about history and ways in which they can perhaps broaden the kinds of work that they do as activists by linking up with and learning about other movements at different historical moments. And in terms of how I would like my book to be read, I don't see my book as a blueprint or anything of that sort. For me, this is an example of poor African American women who developed their own models for labor organizing. And in that sense, I think it's inspirational. It's inspirational for what activists can do today, that you don't have to have a PhD or a college degree or even a high school diploma to make a change and make a difference in this world. And in fact, the power is in your hands. You don't have to follow what somebody else tells you. You can sort of look at the historical moment you're operating and think about your own life and your own history and use that as a basis for moving forward.
No, I think that is so, one of the things that is so powerful in the stories that you tell and the way that the book is organized around their stories, and to sort of highlight this point that I really believe is that working class people make theory and make the history, and so that the theory making doesn't happen external in academia, but that it actually happens in the way in which women and working class people actually talk about their lives, like the storytelling that you mentioned. I just want to highlight for folks the scholars writing in an accessible manner. I want to thank you because you have written a piece on Law at the Margins, which is sort of a quick teaser of your book, but it gives a way for activists to engage with what you're writing, and maybe who may not have time, and want to encourage other scholars to see Law at the Margins as a forum for that. But I do want to delve a little bit in the remaining time of how can activists engage with history or professionals. I mean, can you give some concrete examples, teaching symposiums, or how do they engage with historians or scholars if there is an activist who are interested in that? Like, how might that synergy happen?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's a question of reaching out. I think there are academics who are deeply concerned about social justice. There are a number of social justice programs at institutions around the country. There's one at Case Western Reserve University. There's one at the University of Illinois in Chicago. There's the Barnard Center for Research on Women here at Barnard College. So there are lots of sites, academic sites, that are interested in questions of connecting with activists. So I think activists can seek these spaces out, knowing that there are, in fact, professors, historians, scholars who are deeply committed to social justice and thinking about ways that they can connect. And I think it's a question of making clear what their needs are, right? And their needs might be doing a very specific kind of reading. Their needs might be wanting to work with professors to develop a course in activism and social justice. I find that the courses I teach, where I do in fact collaborate with community organizations and activist organizations, are often the ones that are most popular and successful, and something that not only the students get an important lesson from, but that activists also are able to work closely with students as well as with me. So I think it's a question of reaching out and letting scholars and historians know what it is you need as an activist or activist organization to further the work that you're doing.
And so on that point, are there resources that are centralized where maybe activists can find the scholars? Because oftentimes I hear from many activists, they may not know who's out there, who's receptive, and that's one of the reasons why I bring folks like you who are scholar activists. So now people know that you're someone who's receptive to that kind of engagement. Is there a central place or some way by which activists in their respective fields can know who are the scholars who are open to this kind of engagement? I'd like to post that on our Facebook page. I'd like to encourage folks who do that to reach out to Law at the Margins, because that is part of our mission, is to find that hub of scholar activism. But if there are resources that you're aware of, that would be great to sort of mention that here.
I don't know of any central database that has that information. I just know about specific centers and institutions around the country, and I'd be happy to share a longer list with you to post on the website.
Great. So I want to, we have a few minutes remaining, and I want to encourage folks, if they have any questions, to ask them. You can also pose them on the Facebook page afterwards. Any concluding remarks or thoughts that you want to leave us with in terms of writing the book, domestic worker movement? I mean, we covered a broad breadth of topics, so I apologize for that. But if there's some concluding thoughts that you would like to share and end with, I'd like to invite you to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say that, I would reiterate that a lot of my inspiration for writing this book, as well as my previous work on the welfare rights movement, has always come from the organizing and the activism that I see around me. And I think we do sometimes think about the divide between academia and activism, but I would also just remind people that the disciplines of women's studies, of African American studies, of labor studies, all emerged in the 1970s after the period of vibrant organizing in the 1960s, after the massive social movements were on the national political stage. So there is, in fact, a way in which organizing and activism has always shaped academic struggle and academic writing. So I think that connection is there. It's really just a question of strengthening that and continuing to try to make contacts.
I do want to encourage folks to read Housework Workers Unite and your earlier piece on welfare rights warriors, and to connect with scholar activists, and we hope to bring on more scholar activists onto Law at the Margins. Again, I want to thank you, Professor. I imagine that we've had a good number of listeners, that you may get some follow-up for really being very generous of your time today. And then I also would like to thank Albert Garcia, who is sort of behind the scenes and helped a lot with these Google Chats. So for today, again, I want to thank you, Professor, and hope forward to greater sort of synergies between scholars, historians, and activists. Thank you.
Thank you.